This program is a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Annenberg Foundation and the Friends of Firing Line.
Some months ago, the author Dan Wakefield published a book called Expect a Miracle. He undertook the traditional book promotion tour and came upon a phenomenon not widely perceived in American life. It is that a great many Americans, indeed the overwhelming majority of them, believe in God, and most of them practice their religion, but except from pulpits and to punctuate ceremonial occasions, the mention of God is simply not done. It is taken as a form of bad manners, of intrusiveness. It makes people, blush. It is this phenomenon we wish to explore today with, of course, Mr. Wakefield as one of our guests. His book is subtitled The Miraculous Things That Happen. It is his 15th. He is a renowned journalist. He's written plays and screen dramas and has received numerous awards. Somewhere along the line, he decided that he had become an alcoholic. That discovery came with a flush of faith. He dropped booze and adopted God and told his story in his book, Returning, A Spiritual Journey. Ernest Vandenhage is well known to addicted viewers of Firing Line. He is a sociologist, a philosopher, a legal theorist who has taught at many distinguished colleges and universities and who's published in many fields. I'd like to begin by asking Mr. Wakefield this. How, in fact, have interviewers acted when you raised with them, for instance, the incidence of miracles in the modern world?
Well, they're very uncomfortable. And I've often been reminded of your interview with Malcolm Muggeridge, where you said, I don't know how it is in your country, but in New York, if you mention God more than once at a dinner party, you're not invited back. And,
I didn't know you could mention it once.
That's right. Well, you know, and really, when I started back to church in 1980, I was very aware of that, and very aware that it made people uncomfortable. And in fact, I remember only about 3 or 4 years ago being at a dinner party in New York of some very renowned literary folks. And a friend I went with afterwards said, did you realize there was a taboo subject tonight? And the main subject was the book American Psycho. And while we were eating dinner, people were talking about dismemberment and, you know, so on and so forth as we were...
That was okay.
That was fine. You know, that was a good dinner time subject. And when it skirted next to the subject of religion or God, there was this incredible quiet that came over the room. And we, my friend and I, were afraid to breach it almost. You know, there was a very real sense of discomfort.
How long would you guess this has been so? Certainly during your lifetime and mine.
Yeah.
Was it so 75 years ago, would you guess, or not?
I don't think it would have been so in the time of Emerson.
No, certainly not then, no.
Yeah.
But during this century, would you say that...
I would guess after the First World War. I would think of Fitzgerald's statement, all wars are fought, all gods are dead. And that was sort of taken as that's what now the intellectual, the wise, learned person would think. And I think that's one of the things that carries this, is that the idea is that if you're educated, if you're really a smart person in today's world, that you don't
engage in superstitious talk.
Engage in that. Yeah, you engage in scientific talk, which is approved. And the irony to me, you know, one of the definitions of miracle is an extraordinary event in the physical world that can't be explained by the laws of science. But the laws of science keep changing. And even in my time, I got out of Columbia in 1955, and I was told I was living in a Newtonian universe and everything was solid, and the world was like a great mechanism. And now I'm told that that's not true at all. I'm living in a quantum physics universe, and everything is liquid, and we don't know whether something may be a particle or a wave.
But they don't worry about that.
But no, that's all right. That's totally reversed. And
how would what we have just said apply to folkways in conversational folkways in Europe?
Well, let me start by pointing out I think the miracle requires a little bit more than an extraordinary event not explained by known laws of nature. It requires also some reason to believe that there has been a divine or supernatural intervention.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if I'm suddenly cured of an incurable disease, but I happen not to have appeared to God or anything, then I think it's written down as an unexplained cure and not necessarily a miracle. I think we will speak of a miracle. If this happens, it's totally unexplained by the known laws.
No, this is not really what we're arguing about, though. This is not really what we're arguing about, whether a particular thing is miraculous as a metaphor or miraculous strictly applied. It's a question of whether or not discussions involving God are prohibited by the folkways of Europe the way they seem to be
here.
I
see. I hadn't understood it. Yes, they are, since the rise of science. Science, in effect, requires that there be evidence for any assertion of a specific kind called scientific. And God, almost by definition, is that which we cannot explain, certainly not explained by scientific laws. So people are uncomfortable about it because we are all brought up in the scientific spirit, so that the notion of God, apart from ritual assertions or so, but the actual notion that God intervenes in our lives, in history, etc., that notion makes most people uncomfortable. And you're right, that used to be the case altogether in Europe and not really in the United States as much. Now it's the case in the United States just as much.
In fact, excuse me, I just remember with William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience says God is real because he has real effects. And that was as late as that early part of the century at any rate.
Yeah, but you run into the paradox that although it's true that with the advent of Darwin et al., people, a lot of them tended to depose God. A lot of people did not do so, and the people who did not do so were objectively at least as bright as those people who did.
Right.
But what we don't understand, at least I don't understand, as for instance in your recent experience with your book Miracles, is how is it that the scientific hubris completely overcame the Christian, which has simply not been invalidated by any scientific method.
You see, let me go. You mentioned Darwin. You can go a step further and mention Freud. Freud would explain the belief in God in terms of childhood experiences and so on. Now, many people are under the impression that given this explanation, what Freud has really said, the belief is not true, but that doesn't follow in the least, because the very childhood experiences that lead, according to Freud, to the belief in God could very well be caused by God, if you believe in God. I mean, in short, the trouble which makes people uncomfortable is that the existence of God cannot be disproved. It can also not be proved according to scientific criteria. And I admire Mr. Wakefield in particular because of his optimism and willingness to rely on faith.
Well, presumably God's on our side, too. That helps, doesn't it?
You know, I think this really comes through in the media particularly. And I think that what happens is that, as Professor Brian Hogg said, that it's not something verifiable. And the person at the publisher who was trying to arrange some of these things for me said, a lot of journalists say, well, this isn't a subject we can check. So that immediately puts off bounds.
Unlike human equality.
That's right, yeah. But you know what it made me think of a lot when I was being interviewed? A lot of times what came to my mind, there's a scene from the movie Malcolm X in which Malcolm has come out of jail, he's converted to Islam, he's preaching on the street corners, and one of his old buddies from his criminal days comes up and afterwards says, hey man, that was great. That was fabulous. What's the con? And Malcolm says, there isn't any. And the other guy can't believe it. And I had the feeling a lot of times talking to people in the press, like, well, there's got to be something behind this. And it's sort of like the whole media now is built on expose. We're going to space. Now, I wrote about a woman in Ireland who experienced one of these unusual physical healings, where she was told she had MS, she was paralyzed, she was blind in one eye, she'd lost control of her bodily functions, had a catheter. Well, one of the reporters went over there and interviewed her and her doctor and her priest, came back and said, well, you know, Mr. Wakefield, the whole thing could have been psychosomatic. I said, well, how do you mean? He said, well, she could have brought all these things on herself and then cured herself. I said, gee, that's quite a feat for a woman who works in a factory in Ireland to do all that. And then somebody else who talked with her said, well, you know, I've been talking to some doctors, and it could be that she didn't really have MS, she just had the symptoms of MS. I said, well, wait a minute, you mean you saw the medical records, all these things happened, and she was healed of them, but maybe it's not. Yes, that's right. But like an attempt to undercut and to say,
sure. Yeah, I was in Lourdes a couple of years ago, and I learned there that if you claim a miracle, you got to go through a battery of about 100 unbelieving doctors, and a lot of people who you and I would believe were miraculously cured. The doctors won't certify. They've only certified 85 people in the last 100 years. But what arrests me is not so much their attitude towards miracles as the refusal to engage in conversation in which God figures. For instance, if you have Billy Graham is allowed to have his half hour, whatever it is, and you expect him to go on about God. But if you invite him to lunch, I don't think you're supposed to mention God. At least I've had lunch a couple of times. Nobody did. Is it because that overhang stretches even to that point? Okay, we had God between 11 and 11:30. Now let's go on to normal things.
Yeah, well, you must have had lunch with a lot of media people, too, or that, I don't know, that's very odd to me, because a lot of the people that I met and talked with recently really were anxious to talk about it. Not the people in the media usually, but other people.
Well, perhaps they thought you were especially qualified and that this was your... well, for instance, how...
I wouldn't like to talk about God at lunch either, frankly, because I think I'd like to talk about more frivolous things at lunch.
Well, but you've talked about non-frivolous things about lunch, including with me. And why would God not be one of them?
Well, as I say, I think it's a very heavy subject, which I don't normally want to talk about at lunch, sometimes, perhaps. But
well, people talk about love affairs.
About love affairs, yes, love not. Really.
I don't agree with you. Well, of course, you're a psychoanalyst, among everything else. Are you saying that people don't talk? Well, of course, presumably, you could talk about even God to a psychoanalyst, couldn't you?
Yes, I do.
If you charge enough.
I'm retired, so you can't.
Well, you know, another thing somebody said to me from one of the big TV programs, the producer wanted to do something on the subject, and then found that the person who would do it on the air was uncomfortable because they didn't want to be associated with magic. And to him, anything to do with God, not just miracles, but superstition, yeah. I've also had the feeling, when we talk about the discomfort, like at that dinner party, I've had the feeling that people who know now that I've gone back to church, that I've reclaimed my faith and so on, that they're afraid that I'm going to try to convert them.
Oh, right.
And, or that I'm going to suddenly say, oh, brother, won't you come down the aisle or something, whatever, you know. And that there's a fear. And, of course, I have to suspect that behind that fear is the fear of the hound of heaven. That people are particularly afraid who know that that's back there, that's in their own persona somewhere, and they want to push it away.
Well, let's take a quite relevant case that received a lot of publicity. Senator Helms, before that Pat Buchanan, who in a discussion of AIDS managed to suggest that there was divine punishment being executed for evil behavior. Now, I hasten to dissociate myself from that point of view.
Why?
But,
Why do you hasten?
well, because it seems to me that it would be extra rational to suppose that God would single out that particular sin for punishment when there's so many other
But it's not
competitive
impossible,
sins.
is it?
No, nothing's impossible.
You know, I mean, I don't particularly believe that Senator Helms is right. I have no knowledge, and I don't think he does. But the possibility certainly exists. You cannot just say, no, it can't be. God must approve of these practices, or at least he won't single them out for punishment.
Yeah, but if I did make the point clear, let me make it clear now. Can this be brought up in a conversation in which what Senator Helms or Bat Buchanan said becomes relevant? Can people say what you just finished saying? Might it not be God's word? The answer is no, you can't. Can you?
I think you can only say it at the beginning and end of speeches. If you're a politician, you can't bring it into any kind of relevant thing. In the same sense that I don't think one could bring it into, a liberal politician probably couldn't bring it into talk about welfare reform or that God wishes people not to be poor. I don't think that would be accepted in the political dialogue.
Well, now there I don't think you're 100% right, because Jesse Jackson, not exclusively by any means, but other people can say God's creatures need to be fed and educated. I think you can say that. Not in a laboratory, but in a political campaign, can't you?
Well, in a
I
political
think you can use God in that sense,
Yeah.
but not in a negative sense. I don't think you can say because we have been evil, we are subject to the fate originally designed for Gomorrah. That doesn't get said, does it?
Just Norman Mailer gets to say that, or
Well, he can say
writers,
anything.
or,
Yeah, he's immune.
Yeah.
He can say anything he wants,
right,
and
yeah.
you and I will protect him.
That's But you know, one thing I find interesting, not just politicians, but that it's very rare that God comes up in literature, in contemporary literature, contemporary fiction.
Yeah.
And I remember being really shocked once when there's a play that came out that won the Pulitzer called Mother Night, and it's all about a person contemplating suicide, and they think of every possible reason that might be into it, and never once is that brought up. Never once is the idea of God
Against the divine will.
against whatever like that. And it's a debate. It's a dialogue between a mother and daughter, and never is that said. I think the only writer who I feel like is a novelist has God as part of people's lives is Reynolds Price. You know, he doesn't write, quote, religious novels, but he writes novels in which religion is a real issue to people. And I think that's one of the reasons that the Brideshead Revisited had such an effect when it was shown, that it took seriously the idea of God and religion. Yeah.
Well, but a casual conversation between, say, a couple of college students or graduate students, and the girl's eating her hamburger, says, you know, I've been wondering about the Trinity and the auspices of that idea.
See, there is an example at lunch where somebody...
Well, you're supposed to be curious, right?
Yeah.
To begin with, the person she was lunching with would have no idea of what the auspices of the Trinity were,
Right.
even if he knew what the Trinity was. But mostly, these are questions that don't get asked. Have you revived enough to comment on that?
No, I think you're right, but I think one major thing is the people lack, so to speak, a religious vocabulary. They won't understand what's meant by Trinity and redemption and depravity and any of the need for salvation. Most people certainly no longer understand fully what is meant by these things, even if they know the words. The second thing is that the very notion of God, to the extent to which it still exists in people's minds, has changed. God is no longer someone who wants you to avoid sin and possibly might punish you for sinning. He's someone who forgives a priori everything and admits everything. So,
except Hitler.
Huh?
Except Hitler.
Yeah, perhaps, except Hitler, yeah. But even those who, when you ask them, do you believe in God, will say, yes, I do, really don't, in many cases, believe in the God of the Gospels, as far as I can see. They believe in a God that they have fashioned themselves. Maybe better than nothing, but not very good.
Well, my biggest shock in doing the research for this was talking to some of the theologians. And as a layperson, I didn't realize that advanced theology was setting about disproving the miracles of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I spoke to Father John Crossan, who's an eminent Roman Catholic theologian, and he's part of the Jesus Seminar, where they're trying to say this is exactly what was said or done by Jesus. And he says, well, Jesus didn't heal anybody. He healed the social situation around which they lived. And I said, gee, now, you know, we're living in an age in which the National Institute of Health gives grants for the effect of prayer on recovery from drug addiction, you know, and then the whole mind-body connection is explored and being used in major hospitals. So the idea that Jesus couldn't do this is remarkable to me. It's very strange. And the theologian is telling me this. And I remember I brought up to him, I said I thought the story of John 21, where Jesus, after the crucifixion, appears to the disciples and tells them to cast the nets over the side, and they say it's the Lord, and he fixes the breakfast. And I said, that always seemed to me, as a writer, to have a literalness, a specificity, that I believe that story. And he said, well, you were taken in by a good novelist.
Is that what it is?
Yeah. So, and I was suddenly thinking, how did I get on this part with a theologian? You know,
Well, how do they handle the fact that such eminences as Newman believe it? Was he also taken in? Well, I guess they had, by definition.
I guess so.
Anyone who believes in the literal truth Jesus was just a nice guy, right?
Yeah. And he said, well, see, those stories are metaphors. And I said, another thing that I think people who aren't writers don't realize, that something can be a metaphor and also can have happened. Can be true. It happened, and then it's also maybe seen as a metaphor.
If it is merely a metaphor, I don't think it has anything to do with anything.
That's right. Well, I love the Flannery O'Connor's famous statement. She was at a dinner party in New York, and Mary McCarthy said to her, kind of condescendingly, trying to bring her into the conversation, she says, well, you know, I think that the resurrection and the Trinity, those things are wonderful metaphors. And Flannery O'Connor said, well, if they're metaphors, to hell with them.
Yeah, Ralph Toledano years ago sent his novel to the editor, and where he had heaven and hell, they were capitalized. So the editor simply put him in lowercase, sent him back. So he put him in uppercase, sent him back. This happened 2 or 3 times. Finally, his editor called and said, why are you capitalizing heaven and hell? He said, because they're places, you know, like Scarsdale. But it was that shocking, you know, the notion that one would seek to objectify.
Yeah.
Which one is Scarsdale?
What's that?
Yeah.
Well, people who read your extraordinary book and reacted to it, have you found among any of them any willingness to believe that any of the miracles that you cite might have been an act of divine intervention?
Not those who weren't believers before, to begin with. I think those who are not believers before, they may finally accept that such and such occurred, but they would say, well, it occurred by happenstance, or by it's explainable by some other kind, by some scientific or medical reason, or just like those people talking about the woman in Ireland, oh, it's psychosomatic, or it's only the symptoms of a disease. I never quite got what the difference is if you're that ill, and between having the disease and the symptoms. But at any rate, no, then there's always a way to them justify it, and they're very uncomfortable until they do make that justification.
Is it socially embarrassing to be a Christian in a faculty, in a
Yes.
modern? It is.
Absolutely.
So one just shuts up about it.
Right. Right. Well, not altogether. There's some more respectable types of it. You may be a Thomist, say, as a philosopher also. But to simply assert that there are miracles, that there are due to divine intervention or something, that would be embarrassing in any faculty, I would think.
Even if somebody spots a member of the faculty of church, does that become...
I didn't hear you fully well.
Suppose one is spotted in church on a Sunday.
No, that's regarded as a ritual. That's forgivable. One doesn't assume that people who go to church necessarily believe.
Right,
so.
yes, they may just be fulfilling a social function.
Oh, so that their mother will be pleased or something.
Yes, right, yeah.
Now, did you press this point in talking about your book, or did you simply stick to the subject of the miraculous circumstance?
Well, I did ask when there was an opening or something, and I again, what fascinated me was this, that there's got to be a way around it. You could see people brows furrow as they tried to come up with whatever would be to them a, quote, rational answer. You know, but I love the fact that so many, despite all these experts and medias, that there's such a huge trend in the country, such a hunger for God, the Spirit, however it can be manifested. And again, you know, but what really bothers me too, I had my 1 minute on Oprah, and they had brought the main expert was a man who's a private detective who goes around disproving miracles.
And that's his job.
Yeah, that's his job.
Thank you, Mr. Wakefield. Thank you, Professor Van Hog, ladies and gentlemen.
Next week on Firing Line, host William F. Buckley Jr. talks with MIT professor Steven Pinker, author of The Language Instinct, about regulating the use of words. This program was a Warren Steibel